as it should be.
Hello and welcome. You're watching the Trump Card here on News 9. I am Krishna Kumar. Continuing his economic onslaught, US President Donald Trump has once again turned up the heat on global trade. Trump reiterated that the US is planning to announce a quote-unquote major tariff on pharmaceuticals or drugs imports, a move that could rattle India's pharma industry. So how could India be impacted? Well, the US is India's largest export market for pharmaceutical goods. In the financial year 2024 alone, India exported nearly $28 billion worth of pharma products, and out of that, a massive $8.7 billion went to the US, more than 30%, and that's according to the Pharmaceuticals Export Promotion Council of India. Moreover, India supplies over 45% of America's generic drugs and around 15% of its biosimilars. Industry heavyweights like Dr. Reddy's, Aurobindo Pharma, Zydus, Sun Pharma and Gland Pharma earn anywhere between 30 to 50% of their revenues from the US market. Experts have warned that slapping tariffs on these imports will not just hurt India, it could affect the US as well. It will drive up manufacturing costs of drugs and make essential medicines more expensive and out of reach of the American consumers.
We're going to tariff our pharmaceuticals, and once we do that, they're going to come rushing back into our country because we're the big market. The advantage we have over everybody is that we're the big market. So we're going to be announcing very shortly a major tariff on pharmaceuticals.
So that means a tariff war is also to brew in the pharma sector. More importantly, how will India's drug giants respond? We have a couple of very special guests joining us on this show. We have Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, former ambassador to WTO, joining us. Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us. I'm going to begin by asking, when the tariffs across the world, when he hiked tariffs across the world, the big question was, will pharmaceuticals be excluded from it? Even at that point, he had hinted that there will be tariffs coming on the pharma sector, and it looks like that's going to be a reality sooner than we thought.
Well, the US government directly and indirectly spends a lot of money on pharmaceuticals because the Medicare, the Medicaid, and the US Veterans Administration, for instance, they all have budgetary support from the US for pharmaceuticals. The second aspect is that pharmaceuticals, most of the middle class people in the US are covered under different health insurance schemes. So if the cost of pharmaceuticals goes up, the health insurance premium, which form a very substantial part of the incomes of people, especially the middle and the lower middle income people, they will all have to dole out more by way of their insurance premium. And it's going to put a very substantial burden on people. So this is going to have a definite backlash. That is one thing about the US consumers. The second point is that India charges only about 10% of American pharmaceuticals and others on MFN basis which come into India. Whereas the US charges very little. I think it is in the range of 2% or so. If other countries export pharmaceuticals to the US. So the difference is not very high. And if he's going to do it sectorally, there could be a case for having some 5-6% or maybe 10% at the most duty import tariff imposed on India and others. The others, of course, would vary because whereas India is going to pay only 26% on all items barring pharmaceuticals, the others have been put in different brackets, 54% for and plus
Right.
50% now for China, etc.
Right.
Now, the point that I'm making is that the US is dependent on India for generics and hugely on China for APIs. So if it puts a ban, I mean, not a ban really, but in the case of China, of course, it will amount to kind of a ban, but it will have no other option but to import from India in the short and medium term.
Right. It will have no other option but to import from India. Jayant Gupta, just stay with us. We have Dr. Y.K. Gupta, President, AIMS, Jammu, and renowned pharmacologist now joining us. Dr. Y.K. Gupta, thank you so much for taking time out to be with us here on News9. These new tariffs that Trump is set to announce, in fact, about high tariffs on pharmaceuticals, it will impact Indian companies. Indian companies will have no option but to raise prices and pass it on to the consumers in the US, and that will lead to, it will affect the American public the most.
Yes, I think the issue is not so simple. The Donald Trump has imposed the tariff, are thinking of imposing the tariff because they think that the domestic pharmaceutical production in US is much less, and therefore they want to incentivize the production in US. And one way that Trump thinks that it increase the tariff. Now, how it will impact the India? In India, it is if you just see that today, 4 drugs out of 10, that means every 2 out of 5 in prescription drugs in US is from India generics. That means a huge chunk. And if I see 45% of the generics and 15% of the biosimilars are from India. The US is buying from India because of the 2 reasons. The competitiveness means they are much cheaper than the comparative import from other places, except China or maybe some other places. But also important thing is the quality and the trust which the Indian pharmaceuticals give to them. If they increase the tariff, this will result into 2 things. This will result into the increase in the production cost, but more importantly, the thinning down or reduction in the margin of the profit which the pharmaceutical industry is expected to earn. This will be difficult for those pharmaceutical companies which are running already on thin profit. And therefore, what will happen? Either drug companies, Indian drug companies, reduce the margin of the profit. That's why the apprehension, and that's why you can see the share prices are going down. Or the alternative thing is the increase in the cost of acquisition for the pharmaceutical products by the US consumer. So what will happen?
Right.
The US consumer is likely to get expensive medicine. The Indian pharma industry will get lesser margin, and therefore this will affect both. And I will just say one thing.
Right.
Indian pharmaceutical industry is a very resilient. It
Fair
is
enough.
trusted quality.
Fair enough.
And
Fair enough. India's pharma industry is resilient and is not just importing to the US; it imports to across the world. 1/3 of it, of its exports, go to the US. Ambassador Jayant Dasgupta, it was the question raised on hiking tariffs on pharmaceuticals and drugs was on humanitarian grounds. It is not a tariff to be levied. It's not a bargaining chip on the table, but it's something that's essential, and that's where Trump feels that all the drugs supplied in the US are charged at levels unheard of in other countries in the world, and he wants to protect his claim is that he wants to protect the Indian the American consumers. But the fact of the matter is that with India supplying a huge chunk of the generics drugs, the common drugs to the American public, this will make things more difficult for the public over there.
That is, of course, absolutely correct. The other point which I wanted to mention is that India has the maximum number of FDA approvals for manufacture of drugs, which are required in order to import into the US. So it is not likely that India can be substituted all that easily by some other manufacturer in some other part of the world. So that is a kind of dependence of the US on India, and of course the APIs which the China mainly supplies are exported in huge quantities and volumes. So that can still go on, provided China can sustain this tariff of 104%. So I don't see really that the US has much of an option. If it raises the tariffs, it will be passed on in large measure to the consumers in the US, and the Indian companies may reduce their profit margins a little bit. Having said that, many of the Indian companies, 30 to 40% of their profits are coming from sales to the US market, because it is about $8.7 billion worth of exports that we have made annually. And another thing which needs to be mentioned very clearly for our viewers is that India in 2022 alone, by supplying generic medicines at very reasonable rates, led to a savings of about $219 billion for the US consumer. And between 2013 and 2022, the total savings amounted to about $1.3 trillion. And in the next 5 years, if the US continues to charge little or next to little import tariffs, it's going to lead to another savings of $1.3 trillion in the next 5 years. So these are figures that the administration, US administration, I'm sure would be grappling with. And another thing which came to the fore during the COVID crisis is that it's not all that easy to set up a manufacturing facility at any place in a jiffy. It takes time, investment, of course, and a lot of infrastructure. And the second thing is, there is no certainty that these tariffs will continue forever. So the investor will look at all kinds of options.
Wait, Dr. YK Gupta, there are also Indian pharma companies which have operations in the US, formulations to API. How do you think this will impact those companies and their operations in the US?
Absolutely right. There are a couple of companies like Reddy's lab, like Aurobindo, and maybe even Sun Pharma, Gland Pharma. They have their manufacturing units in US. But that does not mean that the Indian export, they are not doing it. And if you just see the Aurobindo Pharma, the Dr. Reddy's there, and the Zydus, their major profit comes from the generics which are exported to them. So there are two things. One is those who have already in manufacturing plants in US will try to improve or increase the size of their companies. The other companies may also try to put their investment to pharmaceutical manufacturing in US. But as my colleague has rightly said, that setting up of the formulation plant is not till a switch on and off. It takes some time. You need an expertise. You require an investment. You require a lot of inspection by the US FDA, and that will take a few years, maybe 2 or 3 years minimum. And by that time, the tariff will also be reasonably or ultimately be passed on to the US consumer.
Right.
I think it will affect to the US consumer, which will adversely affect on the affordability. Sometimes such increase in the price all of a sudden reduce the availability also. So affordability as well as availability, sometimes shortage of drugs. These are the possible things which the Trump administration will have to consider very, very carefully. Okay. In India, I am very sure that the Indian market will absorb to a certain extent, will not die because of the smaller profit, but definitely some profit margin will reduce, and therefore that reaction which you see in the share market is, I think, overreaction, and maybe it will come back.
Okay. You're saying it's an overreaction, but pharma stocks have been taking a beating in the Indian stock markets for a while now, not just with the announcement of a possible hike, possible major tariffs on pharma imports into the US. But for now, we leave it at that. Ambassador Jayant Das Gupta, former ambassador to WTO, and Dr. Y.K. Gupta, President, AIIMS, Jammu, and renowned pharmacologist. Thank you both of you for taking time out to be with us here on the Trump Card on News9. And with that, we take a very short breather. We'll be back with lots more. Keep it with the Trump Card on News9.
This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News9, English news as it should be.
In the age of OTT platforms, to watch or not to watch, that's the question. Because you are what you watch. It's our review, but your choice to skip it or stream it. Hello and welcome. I'm Krishna Kumar. This is Skip It, Stream It.
आपके वक़्फ़ में एक भी नॉन मुस्लिम नहीं आएगा.
Waqf bill was passed by Rajya Sabha. Opposition parties had challenged the legislation in the Supreme Court. Can Mohammad Yunus be trusted because he met Prime Minister Modi? West Bengal Chief Minister Mamata Banerjee met thousands of teachers and educators. Tharoor said that it took 21 months for Bharatiya Janata Party to impose president rule in the state.
This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News9, English news as it should be.
You're watching the Trump Card. I am Krishna Kumar. US President Donald Trump lashed out, mocking world leaders and rebelled Republicans amidst escalating trade tensions. At an event, Trump claimed that countries were, quote unquote, calling up and kissing my A star, that's all I can say on air at this stage, to make a trade deal, and dismissed critics suggesting that the US Congress should lead negotiations. The remarks came just hours before sweeping new US tariffs on Chinese imports rising to 104% officially took effect. Now, Asian stock markets took another hit on Wednesday as stocks tumbled across the board after US President Trump announced plans to impose tariffs totaling a staggering 104% on Chinese goods, reigniting fears of more trade wars in the offing. Oil prices also plunged nearly 4% as investors' jitters over a possible global recession intensified. This report tells you more.
Stocks plunged again on Wednesday morning after Washington confirmed it would hit China with tariffs totaling 104%. That's a response to Beijing putting its own retaliatory tariffs on US goods. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that Donald Trump was going to escalate.
It was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect.
Japan's Nikkei index tumbled 3% from the open following the news. Hong Kong's Hang Seng index then opened with similar losses. Oil prices also tumbled, falling nearly 4% in Asian trade amid mounting fears of a global recession. That all followed another day of tumult on Wall Street. US stocks initially soared Tuesday on hopes that trade deals were in the offing. Then they plunged back into the red following the China news. The benchmark S&P 500 index fell over 1.5%. It has now seen over $5.8 trillion in losses, marking the worst four-day decline since the index was created in the 1950s. Now the US says talks are scheduled with Japan and South Korea, but officials say they will not prioritize negotiations with China. Beijing in turn has vowed to fight to the end, saying it will not give in to what it calls US blackmail. Speaking late on Tuesday, Trump himself turned up the temperature again, dashing hopes that drug makers would keep their current exemption.
We're going to tariff our pharmaceuticals, and once we do that, they're going to come rushing back into our country because we're the big market. The advantage we have over everybody is that we're the big market. So we're going to be announcing very shortly a major tariff on pharmaceuticals.
Now markets wait to see what US trading partners do next, as his reciprocal tariffs on countries around the world kick in. The EU is widely expected to announce retaliatory levies on American goods ranging from soybeans to sausages.
Now, China has once again hit back by announcing that it will slap a 34% additional tariff on all US imports effective from the 10th of April. The move, confirmed by China's Customs Tariff Commission, comes in direct response to what it calls Washington's unilateral bullying and violation of international trade norms. Remember, US President Trump had signed an executive order imposing what he called reciprocal tariffs, introducing a 10% baseline duty that came into effect on Saturday. Now, the Trump administration has threatened an additional 50% tariff on Chinese goods, pushing the total tariff rate to a staggering 104%. Meanwhile, South Korea is stepping in to support its auto industry amidst fresh economic uncertainties. Seoul announced a package of emergency support measures aimed at softening the blow of Donald Trump's new tariffs, a move that could majorly hit one of Korea's most export-reliant sectors.
South Korea is stepping in with emergency aid for its automakers as a global trade war escalates. Seoul said Wednesday that it would provide financial support for the industry and offer tax cuts and subsidies to boost domestic demand. US President Donald Trump has imposed a 25% levy on US imports of cars starting from Thursday.
So we'll effectively be charging a 25% tariff, but if you build your car in the United States, there is no tariff.
The South Korean government says its car makers look particularly vulnerable as a result, as they don't make many cars in the US. Officials said it was hard to put a number on how much damage would be done. Among the new measures, the government will provide over $10 billion in financial support for the industry. Taxes on automobile purchases will be cut from 5% to 3.5% until June, and subsidies for electric vehicles will also be increased. The government said it would also seek to aid automakers in efforts to raise sales in developing nations. Regarding Trump's tariffs, officials said they would seek to negotiate a solution. Last year, South Korea's automobile shipments to the US totaled almost $35 billion, or about half of the country's total auto exports. Hyundai Motor said last week that it would try to keep prices unchanged in the US despite the tariffs. Shares in the firm were down around 0.5% by early afternoon Wednesday, beating the 1.5% decline for South Korea's benchmark Kospi stock index.
Meanwhile, Vietnam and Spain are drawing closer as both countries face rising trade pressure from the US due to tariffs by Trump, and Vietnamese Prime Minister Pham Minh Chinh and his Spanish counterpart Pedro Sanchez vowed to strengthen economic and defense cooperation in a meeting in Hanoi in Vietnam, and jointly backed the need to uphold free trade in the world. The talks come just as new US tariffs take effect, 46% on Vietnamese goods and 25% on EU or European Union products, a move both leaders say could harm global trade and growth. Vietnam also expressed interest in upgrading ties with Spain to a comprehensive strategic partnership, while Spain indicated that it wants to deepen investments, particularly in railway infrastructure in Vietnam. Remember, it marks the first visit by a Spanish Prime Minister to Vietnam since the countries established diplomatic relations back in the year 1977. Meanwhile, factory workers in Vietnam are voicing growing fears about job security as the latest round of US tariffs take effect. President Trump's sweeping reciprocal tariffs kicking in, hitting dozens of countries, including that 46% levy on Vietnamese exports, with exports making up 30% of Vietnam's GDP, and a trade surplus with the US of over $120 billion last year. Vietnam is under pressure to shield its economy from a further fallout. Hopes that wealthy American consumers might help lift the struggling $400 billion luxury industry are quickly fading. Growing fears that President Trump's renewed tariff blitz could push the global economy into recession are putting pressure on the sector, already in the grip of its worst slump in years. Take a look at this.
Luxury brands have endured their biggest slump in years. There was some hope wealthy Americans might pull the $400 billion a year industry out of its current lull. But fears have grown President Trump's tariff blitz will plunge the world into recession and hit the luxury sector. One Wall Street analyst now expects worldwide sales of luxury goods will fall by as much as 2% this year. That's down from a previous forecast for 5% growth. If it proves accurate, it would mark the industry's longest downturn in more than 2 decades. Trump's tariffs were more sweeping than many market players feared and led to retaliation from China. Shares in luxury sector leader LVMH are down 2% since the start of the year, while Gucci owner Kering has dropped close to a third, and Hermes and Cartier owner Richemont have also sunk. All eyes will be on LVMH when it kicks off first quarter financial reports on April 15th. Key rivals follow soon after with their own numbers. LVMH's Louis Vuitton had hoped sales growth from wealthy Americans would help offset weak demand in China. But signs of weakness emerged even before Trump's tariffs. Citi data released Tuesday showed US credit card spending on luxury brands fell 5% in March and February year on year. Some market watchers had warned at the start of April about growing luxury fatigue and falling US consumer sentiment. Groups like LVMH, Kering and Richemont are expected to draw on their brand's pricing power to shield profits from tariffs. But investors worry shoppers who can afford $10,000 leather handbags and gold bracelets could tighten their purse strings against a darkening economic backdrop.
And with that, it's a wrap here on the Trump Card. Thank you so much for watching. This is Krishna Kumar signing off.
This is India's #1 news network, and you're watching News9. English news as it should be.
What is to the nines? In literal terms, it's perfection. But to us, it's not just a phrase, it's an attitude. One that starts at your desk and sends a statement to the world. To the nines is about taking charge. It's a way of life where every seam, every fold, is crafted with excellence. It's timeless elegance and uncompromising quality made for the corner office. It's the ideas that inspire redefining order and elevating the tabletop. To the nines, for the leaders of today and the visionaries of tomorrow.
आपके वक़्फ़ में एक भी नॉन मुस्लिम नहीं आएगा.
Waqf bill was passed by Rajya Sabha. Opposition parties had challenged the legislation in the Supreme Court.